Honorable Chairperson of the session, Vice Chairperson, learned co-panelists, accomplished scholars sitting on the other side of the dais, and my student friends. Let me contextualize what I'm going to talk about today, because this presentation is basically on the idea of justice, and this was actually something that should have happened yesterday. But because another program, pre-planned program was there, and I had to stay back in Delhi for that 1.5 hour presentation yesterday, so I couldn't make it to Varanasi yesterday. I landed here late evening. So therefore, my presentation might appear to be some kind of a stand-alone presentation on the idea of justice. But I take the solace from the fact that the underlying theme is the same. And we have, some wonderful stories by Dr. Rajendran ji. So I believe that that underlying theme would really be picked up, and the audience, learned audience, might contextualize my presentation, in that perspective. Let me quickly come back to the presentation. I'm talking about the idea of justice basically, and this is the scheme of my presentation. Briefly, I'm talking about the, in its generic sense, what justice really means, how we have structured the idea of justice in the modern context, how Indian system in its original conception actually conceived the idea of justice, what went wrong, where we went wrong exactly during last 200-300 years, because this idea of justice was something that continued even during Mughal phase, if I put it that way, and what exactly we can do. So it's a small idea. There is a slight complex idea, inbuilt in this, which I'm putting in terms of replacing authority by legality, which happened in the British phase. That could be slightly difficult to understand, but otherwise the ideas are, something which can be understood from a common man's perspective as well. Let me quickly introduce the subject. The idea of justice in its most generic sense means this, that everything that is there in this universe has to be at its right place. That everything that we find around has to be in its correct balance. That everybody gets his share in the right way. That he gets his dues properly. All kinds of dues, in terms of society, in terms of economy, in terms of, so like Indian constitutional preamble talking about it, justice in a very defined way, which goes exactly in the tradition of India. Justice, social, economic and political. In fact, if you look at the idea of justice from, because this is the Western perspective, the kind of a system that we have inherited. So if you look at the idea of justice from that perspective, the expression is said to have been derived from the expression zunzer, which means to tie, to bind. So this actually refers to that key element that associates an individual with the larger social system and holds the balance. Sarpalli Radhakrishnan would talk about it in terms of justice and duty, whereby he says that this is an element whereby an individual dissolves himself and grows into the society. That's how it happens. So exactly in the similar fashion, this idea of justice is also there, which gives us or gives an individual an opportunity to dissolve himself and grow into the society, which means growing in terms of a useful unit of the society, in the sense of serving the society as such. if we look at, say, Vedic and Upanishadic tradition, then this idea of justice is missing. In fact, the exact translation of the justice, or the nearest translation of justice, is actually nyaya, that we find in Upanishadic literature. And this nyaya is not exactly justice the way we understand it. This nyaya is actually a different tradition altogether, which is logic, basically. So this Tark Shastra and all that is all about, logic. Now, one may raise this question, articulate this question as to why this idea wasn't there in our Vedic and Upanishadic tradition. The answer appears to be simple from Indian perspective, though, foreigners may not understand it that way, but an Indian mind perceives it clearly. Because Indian system actually believed in a very harmonious monism, that everything emerges from one single reality. So this is how it talks about Brahma Satyam Jagan Mithya Jivo Brahmaiva Napara. I don't think this requires any kind of an explanation. Because in our tradition, the ultimate reality, that harmony in the entirety of things. And this idea was actually represented in the idea of Rith, which was basically an element to hold the system together, exactly the way expression Zunzaya really means. To hold the whole system together, kind of a all-pervading principle that maintains order in the society. So Rith, taken as a whole, really talk about a collectivity of principles, a collection of principles whereby the system is held together. This is precisely what dharma also means. Dhi, dharyate it dharma. In fact, there are a lot of other explanations, I will not get into that. But the idea is that this harmonious monism, as I am terming it to be, or you call it Rith for that purpose, is reflected in variety of expressions like benevolent kingship. The first speaker of the session spoke about it. Benevolent kingship, environmentalism, where everything in the nature, because it is the expression of the Almighty, egoham bahushyama, kind of a concept that we have. So therefore, everything that we see around us, Ishavasya sarvam, yatkincham jagatyam jagat, tena tyaktena bhunjita, magradha kasasvidhanam, doesn't require an explanation from Indian perspective. So everything that we see around is the expression of that Almighty. And as it is referred to in Bhagavad Gita, Yagya Chakra. So simply because human race has been endowed with sort of reason does not entitle it a very special place in the sun, under the sun. It simply gives him an added responsibility to manage this Yagya Chakra. This is what dharma is all about. So, the very fact that we are endowed with reason, gives us an added responsibility to manage this. That's why every small thing under the sun, gives us a lesson. Look at Panchatantra, for example. Every small entity in the natural world, gives us some kind of a example, teaches us, some lesson it teaches. That's how the nature becomes the greatest teacher for Pandit Vishnu Sharma of Panchatantra, right? So this is the way we understand it. And then Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. These are some of the expressions of that, Vedic Upanishadic tradition, where the idea of justice, the way we understand and perceive it today, becomes irrelevant if we understand it from that perspective. But nevertheless, because we practice justice the way we understand it today in the Western tradition, we need to appreciate that as well. So I quickly, provide its contents, the structuring of this idea of justice, the way we understand it today. It can be taken from the basic idea that was presented by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, in which he talks about two types of justice: distributive justice and corrective justice. This distributive justice is matter of a public domain, public law, basically, constitutional law, international law, administrative law, etc., etc., which refers to the macro aspect of, if I put it that way, of justice element, which Rawls and Amar talk about. So Rawls would talk about those principles, which are to be determined behind the veil of ignorance for the purpose of ensuring the element of justice. And Amartya more or less, explains this idea from a different perspective. But the point is that this idea of justice that Aristotle is talking about in Nicomachean Ethics, distributive justice, is a matter of public law domain. In fact, Amartya's work for which he got Nobel Prize was exactly on the same idea, that famines don't happen because of lack of food, but because of breakdown of distributive machinery of the state system. That's how distributive justice is to be understood, being part of public law domain. Okay. Corrective justice is a private law domain, which can be seen in civil and criminal sides as we generally practice it today. So civil justice can further be subdivided, say from family and community perspective. So we have family law domain on the one side, and then contractual and commercial law domain on the other side. This is civil side of the civil side of the justice. Criminal justice is where the state is saddled with the responsibility of correcting justice. It's a corrective element basically. So state is saddled with the responsibility of retributing the wrong done. Therefore, as and when a crime is done, the state is a necessary party in the litigation process, because retribution is to be done, demonstrative effect has to be there. So not only retribution, but even deterrent effect has to be there. So that's how the whole system of justice works today. Quickly moving on to the Shastric tradition of justice. Basically in Dharma Sutra and Dharma Shastras we have all this. So Yajnavalkya's work basically on Raja Dharma, which basically refers to public law associated with distributive justice. I obviously not going to the details, because right now my purpose is to explain the macro element of justice. Vyavahara is the civil law which involve matters of private law, which I have already explained, family and contractual and commercial law, etc. And then you have the third element, prakirnak, which is misleading basically, because it means scattered, diverse, miscellaneous. But if you look at the entire Shastric literature, prakirnak refers to the criminal jurisdiction basically. I have just picked up a few ideas that I shall quickly rush through, given the paucity of time and the constraints of time. Prakirnak refers to a body of law where the king is not a judge basically. King is not perceived to be a judge delivering justice. Rather, he is expected to act like a magistrate, aiming at the chastisement of the wrongdoer. So basically the same idea as you have today, as Dr. Rajendran was talking about. We have a better system probably. And what went wrong, I'll discuss it. So the king appears as a magistrate, which the whole idea is at the chastisement of the wrongdoer, which is retribution and deterrence, both, to these two factors taken together. What was the justice dispensation process? Quickly rushing through. Criminal justice system, that is prakirnak, as it is noted down, and I am picking up from Narad and Katyayana basically, just two elements. It is characterized by the fact that the king take suo motu notice of prakirnak. I believe 15 minutes over, so I have another 15 minutes, or bell has gone
5 minutes over.
Acha, so I get just 20 minutes. Yes. Okay. So Narad and Katyan talk about it. I will just skip this idea and move on quickly. Justice, the list I had given in the previous slide, quoting from Narad and Katyayan. This Prakirnak, this is important for us to note, that Prakirnak varies from author to author and from place to place. The ultimate duty of the king in this context is summarized by Manu as being a Kantak Shodhak. So Kantak Shodhan is basically the function of the king in a criminal jurisdiction, rooting out the thorns of the realm. It talks about the machinery for investigation and inquiry as well. So you have two offices, Stobhak and Suchak, which is like modern policing and investigation agency. You have two types of tribunals as well, which is Dharmasthya and Kantak Shodhan. So Kantak Shodhan is criminal jurisdiction and Dharmasthya is civil jurisdiction. And then you have a very elaborate system of penalties, in view of time, nature and status. Nature of the crime, time of the crime, status of the wrongdoer, whether he relapses into criminality or not. So for example, just one example, that penalty for theft differs from the point of view of the status of the individual. At one place you find an apasthamba, in fact, where if a stealing is done and the person is a Shudra, he will have to repay double of the price of that element. If he happens to be a Vaishya, then 4 times of that. If he is Kshatriya, 8 times of that. And if he is a Brahmin, 16 times of that. So that's how this very elaborate system of penalties is there. This is actually referred to as Vyavahar Pad or Vivad Pad in the entire Shastric tradition. There's an elaborate system of recovery of debt, restitution of deposits, rules between associate or partners, elaborate system of all that. I'm quickly rushing through it, skipping some of them. And then the jurisdiction was largely decentralized. So everybody who is exercising a particular activity seems to have been invested with the legal right to hear disputes between its members. Brahaspati talks about it, and you have general competence like Kula, Shreni and Gana. Now this is like a family group, guild of persons, or the temple Brahmins. These are the 3 jurisdictions. The only point that we need to take note of this is, in this context, that these are not exactly in the line as we understand it in terms of appellate authority, because they had concurrent jurisdiction basically. So there was no appellate kind of a jurisdiction there, though that element is also available in some Dharma Sutras. This is important, and I just back for a couple of minutes to finish this. It's an important idea that with the onset of modernity, as I was talking about in the beginning, when the British Empire established authority, the idea of authority of the law is replaced by the element of legality, the positive law. There's a lot of literature on the subject, in fact. Even in modern English literature we have, like Robert Lingat talking about it, as to what kind of an impact it had on the existing system when the idea of authority is replaced by the idea of legality, the positive law. So, shall be very difficult for me to explain it in a minute or so, but nevertheless, authority is something that has no constraining power in itself. It basically puts itself forward. It shows the way, what kind of a behavior one should have. It doesn't impose itself. So, the kind of a distinction that, Ronald Dworkin makes in principles and rules. So when rules collide, one rule will, give way to the other. So say for example, if there's a rule that you can drive on a given road, say with 40 kilometers speed, the other rule which says that you can drive with 60 kilometers speed would really, will die in a way. But that is not the case of principles. Principles are something different. Principles remains as a floating law. You will have to reach there. How you reach there is a different story altogether. So this authority of the law, which was deferred, but nevertheless it survived, for another type of situation to be handled. Now what happens when the British system comes into play is that this authority of the law is replaced by legality, which means that now a judge will actually draw the meaning from the tradition and will fix the meaning for all times to come, because it has to be positive law. So therefore, now the law shall develop not according to the tradition, but from the judgment of the judge, which he has derived at one point of time. Thereby, the authority of the law was dried up. That way, the authority of the law was, at once dried up, so to say, because now it is open for, only one way to evolve it. So that's how the authority was replaced by legality. And I quickly make another point, though there are a lot of other issues that I intended to talk about, but just a minute or so. What happens to the justice element in this process? So just a minute or so. We need to understand it. Law is not an end in itself. Law is a medium of dispensing justice. But the system that was designed now, in fact, delivers judgment, not justice. That's why my fellow law students will remember it. We call our courts not the courts of justice. We call them courts of law, thereby putting justice onto the back burner. So we are now operating not the courts of justice, courts of laws. Justice remains a distant dream. This happens because of this, authority being replaced by the legality. So justice is not the responsibility of the courts, though it could be the aim of the whole process. This is how we need to understand it. And today we may find a lot of judgments which are technically and logically sound, but they have nothing to do with justice. We can figure out a lot of judgments. I'm a law student, so I can keep on giving a lot of examples, but the time is not there. The last slide, and in 1 minute I finish it. How the judgment-based law is to be turned into justice-oriented judgment and justice-oriented law is the question for us today. For the purpose of suggesting a clue as to how do we resolve it, I just give one example. The point of, just an explanation I would like to, the point of divergence between the present legal tradition and the ancient thought process that we are talking about today, they appear to be irreconcilable at the moment. That is the point. And going back to the roots of Indian consciousness is something that appears to be slightly difficult. But my understanding is that if we keep on continuously reinterpreting these ideas, continuously talking about these ideas the way we are doing it today, probably in the days to come, as the Indian tradition is supposed to be very absorptive in nature. It absorbs everything. Probably it will absorb the good elements of this justice process itself and will emerge into another and stronger system of justice dispensation system. There are a lot of issues that I would have otherwise talked about. Thank you so much for giving this opportunity, and sorry for not being able to explain a lot of issues that I initially designed. Thank you so much.